The mountain was a sentinel of stone and silence, a colossal monument to solitude under a sky that had forgotten the color of joy. Its peaks, sharp as flint shards, scraped at the bruised belly of the clouds, while its slopes were a dense, tangled wilderness of pine and shadow. In this kingdom of granite and quiet sorrow lived a man who was himself hewn from the same unforgiving earth. Silas was a giant, a creature of timber and grief, his shoulders broad enough to bear the weight of the forest, his hands calloused and thick from a life spent wresting a living from the unyielding land. His cabin was not a home but a fortress, a bastion built against the ghosts of memory, against a world that had scoured him hollow and left him with nothing but the echoing silence of his own heart. He had come to this high, lonely place not to live, but to fade, to let the relentless seasons sand him down until he was as smooth and featureless as a river stone. Each dawn was a precise repetition of the last, a ritual of axe and saw, of trap and skinning knife, performed in a profound quiet that had nearly erased the memory of human speech. His past was a locked room within him, the door barred by a loss so immense it had no name, marked only by a small, weathered cross on a bluff overlooking the valley, a silent testament to the wife and child a fever had stolen from him. He was a stoic, wounded hero in a self-imposed exile, his heart encased in a permafrost of sorrow. But the wilderness, in its brutal indifference, is a stage for sudden, raw drama. A storm, born of some distant, malevolent god, had savaged the mountainside for 2 days, a deluge of biblical fury. When it finally broke, leaving behind a world washed clean and trembling, Silas went out to survey the damage. Near the skeletal ruins of an old homestead, a place he usually avoided for the ghosts it held, he saw it. A splash of impossible color against the muted greens and browns of the forest floor. A shock of fiery red, the color of a dying sunset, hanging limp and obscene from a blackened roof beam. He drew closer, his heart a cold, hard knot in his chest. It was a woman, a ginger woman, her flame-colored hair plastered to her skull by the rain, her body swaying gently in the wind like some terrible, forgotten pendulum. A rope was cinched tight around her neck, a crude, merciless noose. Her dress was torn, her limbs a geography of bruises, but it was the mark on her back, visible through a rip in the fabric, that stopped the breath in his lungs. Burned into her skin, a brand of raw, puckered flesh, were 2 words, Apache lover. Before we dive further into the story, don't forget to like and comment where in this wide world you are watching this story from. We love to see how far our stories travel. Anyway, let's get back to the story now. It was a proclamation of hate, a sentence passed and executed by a cruel and unseen judge. He thought she was dead, another casualty of the land's casual brutality. But as he stood there, a giant statue of petrified grief, he saw the faintest flutter of her eyelids, a twitch of a finger. A spark of life, impossibly, stubbornly remained. Without a second thought, the man who had walled himself away from the world of the living drew his knife and cut her down. As her limp form fell into his arms, he heard another sound, a small, terrified whimper from the shadows of the ruined cabin. A child, a little boy with the same flame-colored hair, was huddled in a corner, his eyes wide with a terror that was too vast for his small face. In that moment, the silence of Silas's world was shattered, and the ghosts of his past rose up to meet the horrifying, breathing reality of his present. The man who had sought only to be left alone was now holding the broken pieces of 2 lives in his arms, the weight of their survival settling upon him like a shroud. The journey back to his cabin was a silent, grim procession through the wounded landscape. Silas carried the woman, her body as light and fragile as a broken bird's, her head lolling against his broad chest. The child, Finn, trotted behind him, a small, silent shadow clinging to the back of Silas's leather tunic, his tiny hand clutching the fabric in a grip of desperate terror. The cabin, which had for so long been a sanctuary of solitude, now felt crowded, invaded by the scent of rain-soaked wool, of fear, and of blood. He laid her gently on his own cot, a bed that had known only his own restless sleep for years. Her breath was a shallow, ragged whisper, a thread of sound so faint he had to lean close to hear it. He worked with a grim, methodical efficiency, the skills of a man long accustomed to self-reliance. His large, rough hands were surprisingly gentle as he washed the grime from her face and tended to the raw, weeping brand on her back. The sight of it sent a cold fury through him, a stark reminder of the casual cruelty of the world he had fled. This was not the clean, impartial violence of nature. This was the deliberate, hateful work of men. He bound the rope burns on her neck, his fingers tracing the brutal indentation, a necklace of violence. The woman Alara, drifted in and out of consciousness, her mind a storm-tossed sea of fevered nightmares. She would cry out in a language he didn't understand, her hands flailing as if to ward off invisible demons. And in her delirium, she would whisper a name, not Apache, but Nayati, a word spoken with such desperate love and sorrow that it hung in the small cabin like a ghost. Silas said nothing. He simply worked, his face an unreadable mask of stone. He brewed a poultice of herbs for her fever, forcing the bitter liquid between her cracked lips. He sat a silent vigil through the long nights, the only light from the crackling fire casting his giant shadow across the walls, a silent guardian watching over the broken woman and the terrified child. The boy Finn was his other charge. The child had not spoken a single word since Silas had found him. He would sit on a small stool by the hearth, his eyes, the same piercing green as his mother's, following Silas's every move. He was a small, compressed bundle of watchfulness, his silence a wall as impenetrable as Silas's own. Silas, who had forgotten how to speak the language of tenderness, found himself at a loss. He would leave a bowl of broth for the boy, a piece of bread, and the food would disappear when he wasn't looking. It was a silent, transactional relationship, two solitary creatures orbiting the fragile flame of the woman on the cot. The intrusion into his ordered world was a profound disruption. The presence of the woman and child was a constant, aching reminder of the family he had lost. Every time he looked at Alara's flame-colored hair, he saw a ghost of his wife's sunny blonde. Every time he saw the boy's small, vulnerable form, he felt the phantom weight of his own son in his arms. He resisted the pull of these memories, fought them back with the grim discipline he had honed over years of solitude. He told himself this was a temporary state of affairs, a duty he had to perform. He was a rescuer, not a keeper. Once the woman was well, they would leave, and his silence, his precious, hard-won silence, would return. But as the days bled into one another, a subtle shift began to occur. The silence in the cabin was no longer empty. It was filled with the soft sound of Alara's breathing, with the unspoken terror in Finn's eyes, with the heavy, thudding beat of Silas's own conflicted heart. The world had forced its way back into his fortress, and he could feel the ice around his heart beginning to crack. The first sign of the thaw came not with a word, but with a glance. After a week of fevered delirium, Alara's eyes finally opened and focused on him, clear and lucid for the first time. They were the color of new spring leaves, and in their depths he saw not just fear, but an intelligence, a resilience that surprised him. She didn't scream or cry. She simply watched him, her gaze steady, assessing. The silence in the room stretched, thick and heavy with unspoken questions. He was a mountain of a man, his presence overwhelming in the small space, and she was a broken thing laid low by violence. But there was no pleading in her eyes, no begging for mercy. There was only a profound, soul-deep weariness, and a flicker of something else, dignity. He nodded once, a curt, almost imperceptible gesture, and said the first word he had spoken to her. Water. He held a cup to her lips, and she drank, her throat working convulsively. The act was simple, primal, yet it felt like a treaty being signed, a fragile pact between two wounded survivors. The child, Finn, who had been watching from his usual perch by the hearth, saw his mother was awake and a small, choked sob escaped his lips. He scrambled to her side, burying his face in the blankets, his small body shaking with a week's worth of pent-up terror. Alara's hand, weak and trembling, came to rest on his fiery hair, a gesture of comfort that seemed to take all of her remaining strength. The first verbal exchange between Silas and Alara was as sparse and practical as the landscape outside. Rest, he commanded, his voice a low rumble, rough from disuse. You're safe here. She simply nodded, her eyes never leaving his face, trying to read the terrain of his weathered features. She was trying to understand the nature of the giant who had saved her, this man who moved with such quiet purpose, his kindness expressed not in words, but in the gentle way he tended her wounds, in the steady supply of broth and clean bandages. As her strength slowly returned, a new dynamic began to form in the cabin. Alara was not one to be idle. The moment she could stand on her own 2 feet, wobbly and weak as a newborn foal, she began to move about the small space. She straightened the blankets on her cot with meticulous care. She took a rag and began to wipe down the dusty surfaces of the cabin, her movements slow but deliberate. She found Silas's sewing kit, a crude collection of needles and thread, and began to mend the tear in her own dress, her stitches small and neat. She did not ask for permission. She simply saw what needed to be done and did it. She was proving her worth, not with words of gratitude, but with the quiet language of competence. Silas watched her from the corner of his eye as he sharpened his axe, a strange and unfamiliar feeling stirring in his chest. It was respect. He saw in her the same stubborn refusal to be broken that he saw in the gnarled pines that clung to the mountainside, the same quiet strength that allowed life to persist in this harsh and unforgiving place. The true bridge between these two guarded adults, however, was the child. Finn, seeing his mother slowly returning to him, began to emerge from his shell of silent terror. One afternoon, as Silas was carving a piece of wood by the fire, simply letting the shavings fall where they may, Finn approached him. He held out his small, clenched fist. When he opened it, a perfect, smooth white stone lay in his palm. He offered it to the giant without a word. Silas stopped his carving. He looked from the stone to the boy's wide, expectant eyes. He reached out his own massive hand and accepted the small gift. He held it in his palm, the cool, smooth surface a stark contrast to his own rough, calloused skin. Then he picked up a small, half-finished carving from the hearth, a rough approximation of a bird. He held it out to Finn. The boy hesitated for a moment, then took the small wooden bird, his fingers closing around it as if it were the most precious treasure in the world. A silent transaction. A gift for a gift. An unspoken acknowledgement that a connection, fragile and tentative, had been forged in the heart of that silent cabin. Weeks bled into a quiet rhythm, the sharp edges of their shared trauma softened by the steady pulse of daily routine. The cabin, once a mere shelter, began to take on the shape of a home. It was a transformation that happened not by design, but through the slow, unconscious accretion of small actions. Alara, with her innate sense of order, brought a quiet domesticity to the space. She organized Silas's chaotic stores of dried goods. She mended his worn-out shirts with stitches so fine they were nearly invisible. She found a patch of earth behind the cabin and, using a sharpened stick, began to till the soil for a small garden. She moved with a silent grace, her presence a gentle current that flowed around Silas's granite stillness. Finn, emboldened by the growing sense of safety, filled the silence with the small sounds of childhood. The whisper of his bare feet on the wooden floor, the soft thud of the carved bird as he made it fly through the air, the occasional, quiet hum as he played by the hearth. For Silas, these sounds were both a comfort and a torment. They were echoes of a life he had lost, ghosts of a happiness he had thought buried forever. He found himself watching them, this woman and child who had been thrust into his life, with a strange and unsettling mix of emotions. He would see Alara hanging laundry on a line she had fashioned between two trees, her red hair a vibrant slash of color against the green of the forest, and he would feel a pang in his chest so sharp it almost took his breath away. It was a feeling he hadn't allowed himself to experience in years, a flicker of warmth, a hint of something that felt dangerously like hope. His past remained a locked room, but the door was beginning to creak open on its rusted hinges. One evening, as a cold rain lashed against the windows, he found himself staring into a small wooden chest he kept at the foot of his bed. He hadn't opened it in years. With a deep breath, he lifted the lid. Inside, nestled in folds of yellowed linen, was a small, worn dress of pale blue cotton, and a faded daguerreotype of a smiling woman with kind eyes and a small boy with a mischievous grin. His wife, Sarah. His son, Thomas. The narrator's voice would gently fill the space, revealing the story Silas could not speak. It would tell of the fever that had swept through their small settlement like a prairie fire, of the helplessness of watching his family fade before his eyes, of the all-consuming grief that had driven him into the mountains, a man fleeing the ghosts of his own heart. He looked up from the chest to see Alara watching him, her expression one of quiet understanding. She didn't ask. She didn't pry. She simply held his gaze, her eyes full of a shared sorrow, a silent acknowledgement of the universal language of loss. In that moment, he knew she understood. The mystery of Alara's own past began to unravel in fragments, in whispers torn from the fabric of her nightmares. She would cry out in her sleep, her body rigid with terror. One night, Silas was woken by her screams. He went to her side, and in her fevered state, she clung to him, her words a torrent of garbled fear. "No! Jedediah, don't let him! Nayati!" The names tumbled out, shards of a broken story. Later, in the calm light of day, she would speak of it, her voice low and halting, her eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the cabin walls. She spoke of a husband, Jedediah, a man of wealth and influence in their town, a man whose piety was a thin veneer over a core of brutish cruelty. She spoke of his possessiveness, his rages, his fists. And she spoke of Nayati, He was an Apache man, a trader who had shown her a kindness she had never known. He had seen the bruises, the fear in her eyes. When she had finally found the courage to flee with Finn, it was Nayati who had guided them, who had promised them safe passage. But Jedediah and his men had hunted them down. They were a posse not of law, but of vengeance. The narrator would describe the scene she could not bear to put into words. The capture, the brutal murder of Nayati, the fire that consumed his small camp. And then, the ultimate act of cruelty, Jedediah himself heating the branding iron, searing the words Apache lover into her flesh as a mark of her transgression, a permanent scar of his possession. They had left her hanging from that beam, a final, public declaration of his power, a warning to any who would defy him. They had left her to die, never imagining that a giant in the mountains would intervene. As she spoke, Silas listened, his face a mask of cold, controlled fury. The world he had tried so desperately to leave behind, with its petty cruelties and its corrupt men, had followed him up the mountain. And now, it was threatening to destroy the fragile peace he had found in this small cabin with this broken woman and her silent child. The fragile bubble of their sanctuary was destined to burst. The outside world, with its noise and its malice, was a patient predator, and it was only a matter of time before it found them. The first sign of its approach came in the form of a lone trapper, a grizzled old man named Elias who passed through Silas's territory once a year to trade pelts for supplies. He was the one thread connecting Silas to the world he had renounced, and his arrival was usually a source of terse, practical information about the price of beaver skins and the severity of the coming winter. This time, however, Elias brought news of a different kind. As they sat by the fire, sharing a pot of coffee, the old trapper spoke of the goings-on in the nearest settlement, a dusty, fly-blown town called Redemption. "Whole town's buzzing," Elias said, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into the flames. "That big man, Jedediah Thorne, the one who practically owns the whole valley, he's offering a reward. A big one. For his runaway wife and kid." Silas's hand, which was lifting the coffee cup to his lips, froze. He kept his face impassive, his eyes fixed on the fire, but inside him, a cold dread began to spread. Elias, oblivious, continued. "Says she run off with some Apache buck. Thorne and his boys went after him. Caught the savage, they say, and strung him up proper. But the woman and the boy got away. Thorne wants him back. Bad." At that moment, the cabin door creaked open and Alara stepped inside, a bundle of firewood in her arms. She stopped dead when she saw the stranger, her eyes wide with a sudden, primal fear. Elias, a man not known for his subtlety, stared at her, his gaze lingering on her fiery red hair. A slow, dawning comprehension spread across his weathered face. He looked from Alara to the small boy, Finn, who was now peeking out from behind her skirts, and then back to Silas. The air in the cabin grew thick and heavy with unspoken understanding. Elias, to his credit, said nothing more. He finished his coffee in silence, his eyes darting nervously between the woman and the giant. When he left, he gave Silas a long, meaningful look, a silent warning that trouble was on the wind. The news shattered the quiet peace they had so carefully constructed. The name Jedediah was a poison that seeped into the very logs of the cabin. Alara became a ghost of her former self, her movements furtive and jumpy, the spark of resilience in her eyes extinguished and replaced by a familiar, hunted look. She would stare out the window for hours, her gaze fixed on the distant trail, expecting to see the silhouette of riders against the horizon. The threat was no longer a phantom from her past. It was a tangible, approaching reality, a storm gathering on the edge of their world. The landscape itself seemed to respond to the shift in mood. The clear, crisp autumn days gave way to a sky the color of slate. A low, persistent mist clung to the forest floor, shrouding the trees in a damp, gray gloom. The mountain, which had begun to feel like a protector, now felt like a trap, its vastness no longer a comfort but a cage. Silas felt the change in the air, in the woman, in himself. The quiet solitude he had once cherished now felt like a dangerous isolation. The protective instincts that had lain dormant for so long were now fully awake, honed to a razor's edge. He was no longer just a man hiding from his own ghosts. He was a guardian. He watched Alara pace the small cabin, her fear a palpable thing, and he knew that the time for hiding was over. The world was coming for them, and he would have to be ready to meet it. His gaze shifted to the high shelf where he kept his rifle, its long, steel barrel gleaming dully in the firelight. It was a tool he used for hunting, but he had learned to use it for other purposes in a war he had tried hard to forget. The skills he had buried along with his past were now stirring, called forth by the approaching storm. The inevitable crisis came to a head one moonless night. The wind howled outside the cabin, a symphony of rage that rattled the window panes and clawed at the roof. Inside, the tension was a living thing, a fourth presence in the room alongside the man, the woman, and the child. Alara could bear it no longer. The fear of what Jedediah would do to her, and worse, to Finn, was a cancer eating away at her soul. She could not, would not, bring that darkness down upon the man who had shown her such quiet, gruff kindness. She waited until Silas was asleep, his massive form still and silent on a pallet he had made for himself by the hearth. With movements as silent as a falling leaf, she gathered their few meager belongings into a small bundle. She wrapped a sleeping Finn in a thick blanket, his small face peaceful and innocent, oblivious to the terror that gripped his mother's heart. She looked one last time at the sleeping giant, his face softened in the firelight, and a single tear traced a path through the grime on her cheek. It was a tear of gratitude and of profound regret. She slipped out the door and into the raging storm, a lone figure swallowed by the immense, roaring darkness. She didn't get far. A hand, as firm and unyielding as a tree root, closed around her arm. She gasped, spinning around to see Silas standing there, a massive silhouette against the tumultuous sky. He was not angry. His face, illuminated by a flash of distant lightning, was a mask of grim resolve. "Where are you going?" he asked, his voice a low rumble that was nearly lost in the wind. "I have to leave," she whispered, her voice breaking. "He's coming. I can't let him find us here. I can't bring this on you." She tried to pull away, but his grip was gentle and absolute. "And go where?" he said, his tone practical, cutting through her panic. "Into the storm? With the boy. He'll hunt you. He'll find you. You won't last a day." His words were harsh, but they were the truth, and she knew it. Despair washed over her, and she slumped against him, the fight draining out of her. "Then what are we to do?" she cried, her voice raw with anguish. "There is no place for us." He looked down at her, at the small, fierce woman who had endured so much, and then at the sleeping child in her arms. He looked back at the warm, flickering light of the cabin, the small pocket of life they had carved out of the wilderness. In that moment, a choice was made. The walls he had built around his heart for so long finally, definitively crumbled. "Yes, there is," he said, his voice softer now, but with an undercurrent of steel she had never heard before. "Here." It was not a plea. It was not a question. It was a statement of fact. A declaration. He was no longer just a rescuer offering temporary shelter. He was offering a fortress. He was offering a stand. "Here," he repeated, his gaze unwavering. "You have a chance. Out there, you have none." The subtext of his sparse words was a promise, a vow as solid and enduring as the mountain on which they stood. He was promising her his protection. He was choosing to stand between her and the darkness that was hunting her. He gently took the sleeping boy from her arms, his massive hands cradling Finn with an almost reverent care. He turned and walked back toward the cabin. "Come inside, Alara," he said over his shoulder. "The storm is getting worse." She stood frozen for a moment, the wind whipping her hair around her face, the rain stinging her skin. But for the first time in a very long time, she did not feel alone. She followed him back into the light, back into the warmth, back into the home that this silent, wounded giant was now willing to defend with his life. The next morning, the storm had passed, but the air was still charged with a new energy. Silas was a man transformed. His movements were no longer just the slow, methodical actions of a homesteader. There was a new purpose, a new intensity in everything he did. He was a soldier once more. He began to fortify the homestead, not just for the coming winter, but for the coming war. He reinforced the cabin door, barred the windows, and cleared sight lines through the trees. His past as a soldier, a detail he had kept buried, now revealed itself in his strategic thinking, in the way he assessed the landscape for tactical advantages and vulnerabilities. He was turning his refuge into a stronghold, and his solitude was officially, irrevocably over. The waiting was a quiet torment, a stretching of the nerves that was almost worse than the confrontation itself. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig in the forest, sent a jolt of adrenaline through them. Alara found it hard to breathe, her body a coiled spring of anxiety. But Silas was a rock, a center of calm in the storm of their anticipation. He went about his preparations with a quiet, focused intensity that was both terrifying and deeply reassuring. He cleaned his rifle with meticulous care, the click and slide of the metal components the only sound in the tense silence of the cabin. He taught Alara how to load it, his large hands guiding her smaller ones, his touch impersonal and practical, yet a strange intimacy passed between them in that moment of shared purpose. One afternoon, as the sun began to dip below the jagged peaks, casting long, menacing shadows across the valley, they appeared. 3 riders, emerging from the tree line like wraiths. They were not moving with the caution of hunters, but with the arrogant swagger of men who believed the world belonged to them. The man in the lead was tall and imperious, dressed in fine clothes that looked strangely out of place in the rugged wilderness. It was Jedediah Thorne. Even from a distance, Silas could feel the aura of cruel, self-righteous power that emanated from him. As they drew closer, he dismounted, his movements stiff and proprietary. He strode toward the cabin as if he already owned it, his 2 hired thugs fanning out behind him, their hands resting on the butts of their pistols. Silas stepped out of the cabin to meet them, positioning himself squarely in the doorway. He was an intimidating sight, a giant of a man with the impassive face of a stone idol. He held no weapon, but his presence alone was a formidable barrier. "I am Jedediah Thorne," the man announced, his voice laced with an arrogant condescension. "I'm looking for my wife. She is my property, stolen from me by a savage. I have reason to believe she came this way." He did not look at Silas as an equal, but as an obstacle, a piece of the landscape to be navigated or removed. "There's no one here but me," Silas said, his voice a low, flat rumble. It was the simple, unadorned truth of his life until a few weeks ago, and he spoke it with a conviction that was unnerving. Jedediah's eyes narrowed, his gaze flicking past Silas to the cabin door, as if he could see through the solid wood. "I have a warrant from the circuit judge," he blustered, pulling a piece of paper from his coat. "It gives me the authority to search any dwelling in this territory for my fugitive wife and son." At that moment, as if on cue, the cabin door creaked open a few inches. A small, terrified face with a shock of red hair peeked out. It was Finn. Seeing the strange, menacing men, his face crumpled in fear, and he instinctively ran, not to the mother hiding in the shadows of the cabin, but to the giant who had become his protector. He wrapped his small arms around Silas's leg, burying his face in the rough fabric of his trousers. The sight was a dagger to Jedediah's pride. It was a living, breathing tableau of the new family unit that had replaced him. His carefully constructed facade of righteous civility cracked, revealing the raw, ugly rage beneath. "So, the mountain man plays house with a whore and her half-breed brat," he sneered, his voice dripping with venom. "Give her to me. Now. The law is on my side." "There's law," Silas said, his voice dangerously quiet. "And then there's what's right. And you are a long way from both." He gently pushed Finn behind him, shielding the boy with his massive frame. He had not moved, he had not raised his voice, but a line had been drawn. The clearing in front of the cabin became a battlefield, the air crackling with the promise of violence. Jedediah, consumed by his own arrogance, failed to read the signs. He saw only a dumb, hulking brute standing in his way. He gestured to his men. "Take the boy. I'll deal with him." It was the last mistake he would ever make. The world exploded into motion. The slow burn of tension that had been building for weeks ignited into a conflagration of sudden, brutal violence. Jedediah's men, emboldened by their employer's arrogance and the promise of payment, moved forward. They were not prepared for what they faced. They saw a quiet homesteader. They met a seasoned soldier. The first man, a swaggering brute with a scarred face, reached for Finn. Silas moved with a speed that was shocking for a man his size. He didn't bother with the rifle leaning against the doorframe. His body was the weapon. He met the man's charge not with a fist, but with an open palm to the chest, a move of pure, concentrated force that lifted the man off his feet and sent him crashing backward into the dirt, the air leaving his lungs in a pained whoosh. The second man, seeing his companion fall, was smarter. He drew his pistol, but Silas was already moving, closing the distance in 2 long strides. He grabbed the man's gun hand, twisting it with a sickening crunch of bone. The pistol clattered to the ground. Silas's other hand shot out, grabbing the man by the throat. He didn't squeeze. He simply held him there, his feet dangling inches off the ground, his face turning a dusky purple. Jedediah, his face a mask of disbelief and fury, drew his own ornate pistol. "I'll kill you," he screamed, his voice a high-pitched shriek of impotent rage. He aimed, not at Silas, but at the cabin door, at the woman he considered his property. But before he could pull the trigger, a blur of motion came from the side. Elara, no longer a victim cowering in the shadows, burst from the cabin. She was not a warrior, but she was a survivor. In her hands, she held the heavy, cast-iron skillet from the hearth. She swung it with all the force of her desperate, protective rage. The skillet connected with Jedediah's gun hand with a sickening thud. The pistol flew from his grasp, landing in the dust. He howled in pain, clutching his shattered fingers. The fight was over in less time than it takes to draw a breath. It had been a swift, decisive, and utterly one-sided confrontation. Silas dropped the choking man he held, who collapsed to the ground, gasping and retching. The first thug was still struggling to get his wind back. And Jedediah Thorne, the man of power and influence, was on his knees, cradling his broken hand, his arrogance shattered into a million pieces. Silas stood over them, a giant breathing heavily, his chest heaving not from exertion, but from the adrenaline of battle. He was a terrifying figure, a force of nature unleashed. He looked down at Jedediah, his eyes cold and hard as river stone. There was no triumph in his gaze, only a weary disgust. "Get up," Silas commanded, his voice a low growl. The men scrambled to their feet, their eyes filled with a new and profound respect for the giant of the mountain. They looked at him not as a homesteader, but as a creature of immense and terrible power. "Take him," Silas said, nodding toward Jedediah, "and get off my land. If I ever see any of you in these mountains again, I will not be so merciful." He didn't need to say another word. The threat hung in the air, absolute and undeniable. The two thugs, eager to be anywhere else, hoisted their whimpering, broken employer onto his horse. They turned and fled, not with the arrogant swagger with which they had arrived, but with the frantic haste of men who had stared into the face of their own mortality and found it wanting. Silas, Alara, and Finn stood in the clearing, watching them go until they were just small, retreating specks in the vast wilderness. The immediate threat was gone. The silence that descended upon the clearing was different from the silence that had come before. It was not empty. It was filled with the aftermath of battle, with the scent of churned earth and fear, and with the deep, shuddering breaths of three people who had faced the darkness and survived. The climactic confrontation was over, swift and decisive, and in its wake the long, slow work of healing could finally begin. The silence that followed the departure of Jedediah and his men was profound, a vacuum left by the storm's passing. The immediate, violent threat was gone, but the echoes of the confrontation remained. Silas stood for a long time, his massive frame outlined against the setting sun, his gaze fixed on the trail where the men had disappeared. He was a statue of grim victory, his knuckles white where he clenched his fists at his sides. The soldier in him was slowly receding, making way for the quiet man of the mountains once more. Alara, still holding the heavy skillet, let it drop to the ground with a soft thud. The adrenaline drained away, leaving her weak and trembling. Finn, who had been hiding behind Silas's legs, peeked out, his eyes wide. He looked at the retreating figures, then up at the giant who had protected him, and finally at his mother. He ran to her, and she knelt, wrapping him in a fierce embrace, burying her face in his fiery hair. The danger had passed, but the scars remained, both visible and invisible. Later that evening, inside the quiet sanctuary of the cabin, the true healing began. It started not with words, but with actions. Silas took a clean rag and a bowl of warm water and, without a word, knelt before Alara. He gently took her hand, the one that had wielded the skillet, and began to clean the scrapes on her knuckles. His touch was incredibly gentle, a stark contrast to the brutal efficiency he had displayed just hours before. She watched him, her throat tight with an emotion she couldn't name. It was more than gratitude. It was a deep, soul-shaking recognition of the bond that had been forged between them in the crucible of fear and violence. When he was finished, she reached out, her fingers hesitating for a moment before lightly touching the bruise that was beginning to form on his cheekbone where one of the thugs had landed a glancing blow. It was the first time she had initiated contact, a simple, questioning touch that spoke volumes. He didn't pull away. He simply closed his eyes for a moment, accepting the gesture. The external threat was gone, but the internal wounds still needed tending. The brand on Alara's back was a permanent reminder of her past, a symbol of Jedediah's cruelty. But as she sat by the fire that night, she felt its meaning begin to change. It was no longer just a mark of shame. It was a testament to her survival. It was a part of a story that no longer ended with her hanging from a rope, but with her sitting safe and warm in a cabin, protected by a quiet giant and her resilient son. The most profound healing, however, happened in the heart of Silas himself. The final walls he had built around his grief, the last vestiges of his self-imposed exile, finally came down. Later that week, as they sat together in the comfortable silence that had become their new language, He rose and went to the small wooden chest at the foot of his bed. He opened it and took out the faded daguerreotype of his wife and son. He didn't hide it. He didn't put it away. He walked over to Alara and simply held it out to her. She took it, her gaze falling on the smiling faces from his past. "Sarah," Silas said, his voice thick with emotion. "And Thomas." He spoke their names aloud for the first time in years, not as ghosts to be feared, but as memories to be honored. He was not replacing them. He was making room in his wounded heart for a new family and new life. By sharing his deepest sorrow with her, he was letting her in completely. He was telling her that his past was a part of him, but it was no longer his prison. The cabin, once a fortress against the world, was slowly, irrevocably becoming a home. They began to build a future, one small act at a time. Together, they finished tilling the small garden patch, their hands working in the same soil. They planned for the coming winter, not as two separate individuals, but as a unit. The quiet building of trust had blossomed into a quiet, unshakable love. It was a love that didn't need flowery speeches or grand declarations. It was in the shared glances across the hearth, in the comfortable silence as they worked side by side, in the way he would leave a perfectly carved wooden animal by Finn's bedside, and in the way she would place a wildflower in a cup on the mantelpiece, a small touch of beauty in their rugged world. The long, slow resolution was not about forgetting the pain of the past, but about integrating it into a new and hopeful future. It was about two broken people and one small child, finding in each other the strength to heal, to trust, and to build a new life in the heart of the unforgiving wilderness. The seasons turned, painting the mountain in new colors. The fiery gold of autumn gave way to the pristine, silent white of winter, and then, finally, to the vibrant, life-affirming green of spring. A year passed. The mountain, which had once been a symbol of Silas's isolation and grief, was now the backdrop for a story of rebirth and quiet joy. The cabin was no longer a place of exile. It was a home, filled with the warmth of the fire, the scent of baking bread, and most remarkably the sound of laughter. Finn, no longer a silent, haunted child, was a whirlwind of boyish energy, his chatter and questions filling the spaces that had once been dominated by a heavy silence. He followed Silas everywhere, his small hand often tucked into the giant's massive one, a tiny boat sailing in the wake of a great, gentle ship. Silas, the stoic, wounded hero, was transformed. The harsh lines of grief on his face had softened, replaced by a quiet contentment. The love he had for Alara and Finn had reopened his heart, not erasing the scars of his past, but allowing new light to enter. He was still a man of few words, but his silence was no longer born of sorrow. It was a comfortable, peaceful silence, the silence of a man who was finally at home in his own skin, in his own life. Alara, the resilient survivor, had blossomed. The hunted look was gone from her eyes, replaced by a serene and joyful strength. She moved with a confidence and grace that spoke of a woman who had not only found safety, but had found her own power. The brand on her back was still there, a permanent map of her journey, but it held no power over her now. It was a symbol of a battle won, a past overcome. Together, they were a family forged not by blood, but by the shared crucible of survival and the slow, patient building of love. We see them in a final, quiet tableau. Silas is sitting on the porch of the cabin, mending a piece of leather. Finn is at his feet, carefully trying to imitate his actions with a scrap piece of his own. Alara comes out of the cabin, carrying a basket of wild berries, her red hair shining like a beacon in the afternoon sun. She smiles at Silas, a smile of such pure, uncomplicated love that it seems to light up the entire valley. He looks up and returns the smile, and in that shared glance, a whole universe of understanding, of shared history and future promise is exchanged. The landscape, once so harsh and unforgiving, now seems to cradle them in a gentle embrace, its beauty a mirror of the peace they have found. The mountain is no longer a tombstone, it is a cradle, a sanctuary, a home. If this story of survival, of the healing power of love, and the forging of a new family in the face of impossible odds moved you, it is because it speaks to a universal truth. It reminds us that even in the harshest of wildernesses, even in the deepest of sorrows, the human spirit has an incredible capacity for resilience. It shows us that strength is not always loud and aggressive, but can be found in quiet competence, in enduring patience, and in the courage to trust again. It teaches us that the deepest wounds can be healed, not by forgetting the past, but by having the courage to build a new future. The story of Silas, Ilara, and Finn is a testament to the fact that home is not always a place you are born into, but sometimes it is a fortress you build, a sanctuary you create with the unlikeliest of allies. It is a quiet promise that even after the most brutal of storms, the sun can and will shine again. For more stories that explore the depths of the human heart and celebrate the enduring power of hope, subscribe to our channel and join our community of storytellers, and don't forget to leave your suggestions or feedback for the next videos.